Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Cutler. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you're all doing well. I'm joined today by Lee Vinsel, who will be speaking about the Innovation Delusion, how our obsession with the new has disrupted the work that matters most. Welcome, Lee.
Thanks for having me.
We're very excited to have you here today and to learn about the Innovation Delusion. I'll give some quick housekeeping information for our audience and then introduce Lee. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please click the Ask a Question button below the video to ask your questions throughout the webinar. Also, as a reminder, the recording will be available tomorrow. Lee Vinsel is an assistant professor of science, technology, and society. He's also co-director of the Maintainers, which is a global interdisciplinary research network focused on maintenance, repair, and the everyday work that keeps our world going. Lee recently co-authored, along with Andrew Russell, the book, The Innovation Delusion, How Our Obsession with the New Has Disrupted the Work That Matters Most. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, and other outlets worldwide. Thanks, Lee, for joining us and taking the time to be here with us today. I'll let you take it away from here.
Thanks, Julia and Fred, for having me today. It's really great to be here. I'm looking forward to talking about my work today. Give me 1 second to get my screen going here. Okay, so hopefully you can see this, and Julia and company, please let me know if it's not showing up right. Today I want to talk to you about my recent book with Andy Russell, The Innovation Delusion, as well as the work we've been doing for the last 6 or so years, including creating a group called the Maintainers, which is a kind of global interdisciplinary research network focused on maintenance, repair, and the ordinary work around us that keeps our world going. So here's the cover of the book. And when I talk about our work, I like to explain to people that the Maintainers, this group, really started off as a joke. So Andy Russell and I had been kind of cranky about the way people had been talking about innovation in higher ed. We work in universities, in businesses, in Silicon Valley, in the tech world, and so on. And we had been giving talks kind of criticizing the way people talked about innovation for a while, but then our ideas really came together when in 2014, I believe it was, Walter Isaacson published his book, The Innovators, How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution. And Andy sent me an email and said that we should respond with Isaacson's book with one of our own, which we would call The Maintainers, How Bureaucrats, Standards Engineers, and Introverts Created Technologies That Kind of Work Most of the Time. During that time, I was a blogger, so I kind of blogged about this idea, and we played with it on Twitter, and started kind of taking off and taking on a life of its own. And then in early 2016, 2 things happened. So we held our first conference just called The Maintainers at Stevens Institute of Technology, where we both worked at the time. And on the same day of April 8th, our essay, Hail the Maintainers, dropped on Aeon, the online magazine. And then, to our surprise, the idea took off even more, and it kind of became viral. So it got picked up by The Atlantic and The Guardian, Le Monde. We started receiving emails from Australia and Africa and Russia. Eventually, we got invited to write an op-ed for the New York Times, and there was an episode of Freakonomics Radio about the idea. And finally, it led to our book. So I like to tell the story of the joke because kind of where I've ended up and the things I've ended up thinking about for the last 6 or so years really are a kind of I would say a bit of luck or something I fell into rather than something that was pre-planned. And what I would like to do today with you is kind of unpack what I see as some of the conceptual frameworks that are inherent in that joke, which often does work for many people. So just to give you a kind of brief outline of where this is headed, today I'm going to first give you a brief history of what we call innovation speak and the costs of innovation speak. Then I'm going to talk about how innovation speak leads us to neglect maintenance and maintainers. And then I'm going to kind of offer some hope at the end and talk about how we can improve maintenance and the lives of maintainers by adopting a maintenance mindset. So to begin with, a brief history of innovation speak. In the book and in other works, we really like to make a distinction between what we call actual innovation, which is the process of introducing new things, processes, business models into the world, and innovation speak, which is the way we've come to talk and think about innovation and especially technological change in the last 50 or 60 years. And our point here, obviously, is that actual innovation and innovation speak are two different things, and often they're not even very related. But to start off, we have to kind of account for how we've come to value and praise innovation as an implicit good, because for most of human history, innovation wasn't seen as a good. And in fact, the word innovation was used in negative ways. So in the church-dominated Middle Ages, innovation was heresy. Right? Innovation was introducing new ideas or religious rituals. So in 1548, the King of England, Edward VI, issued a proclamation against those that doeth innovate. So, and the point here is that to innovate was to sin, and it could even get you killed and burned at the stake. So obviously something's really changed in our culture where we kind of go from, treating innovation as an evil to treating innovation as this implicit good that we're all supposed to aspire to. So the question is, well, what happens there? And part of the story we think is caught up in the story of the Industrial Revolution and how all the technological change that's happened over the last 150 or 200 years. Beginning in the 19th century, we started introducing technologies like the railroad and telephones and telegraphs, automobiles, airplanes, eventually electronics and computers. There's been this massive technological revolution. And even by the mid-19th century, in 1851, the author Samuel Smiles published his book, The Lives of Engineers, and other books of this sort that were celebrating inventors and engineers as kind of giving great benefit both to the economy and to our everyday lives and our quality of lives. And then, by the late 19th century and the early 20th century, you have cults of kind of form around inventors like Edison and Graham Bell and Tesla and all these characters, Ford, all these characters that you know so well. So my point is, there starts to be some change around the way we value change. And yet, heavy use of the word innovation comes later. It's actually a post-World War II story. And this is a Google Ngram. I'm going to show you a couple of these throughout the talk. And what it's showing here, Google Ngram is a free tool. You pump in a word or phrase, and it shows you usage of that word or phrase over time. And so what this curve here is showing you is that use of the word innovation. Remember, this is not innovation itself. This is talk of innovation. Use of the word innovation starts going up after World War II. And, the steepest periods in this one are in the 60s and the 1990s. I should have given you a more updated one. We now know, because Google updated its tool, it now comes basically to last year. Use of the word innovation has increased until basically last year, until the very present moment. So the question is, why? Why did people start talking about innovation more? And I think there's lots of complex reasons and causes for this change in our culture. But we like to focus on one of them, which is a story about economists. And in the late 50s and early 1960s, economists were wrestling with a mystery. They really were just starting to have good economic statistics, which we'd started collecting during the Great Depression and the New Deal. And in the 1950s, they were trying to explain all of the economic growth and the great bounty that was arising as a result of, the post-World War II boom. Only the factors that were traditionally supposed to explain growth, which was changes in labor, like educating the workforce, and capital, changes in capital, like buying more machines, were not explaining all the growth after World War II. So economists like Robert Solow hypothesized that this mysterious X factor that was explaining all this growth was technological change, or what ended up being called technological innovation. And so you can see here's the term technological innovation taking off right at the end of the 1950s and heavily in the 1960s. And then you can see that the term technological innovation starts tapering off in the 1990s because I argue, and others have argued, that technological innovation kind of became synonymous with technology. So you no longer needed technological as a modifier. You just called it innovation. So if we believe, and economists believe, policymakers came to believe, business leaders came to believe, university administrators and so many other people came to believe that all of our economic growth and changes in quality of life were coming from innovation, it's very natural to want more innovation and to look for ways of producing more innovation. And so just to give you a couple other things that were happening during this time that were kind of reinforcing this turn to innovation speak. In the late 1970s and then in the 1990s and later, people started talking about innovation policy, which were policies that governments, nations could put in place to spur on, more innovation. And this became a kind of central goal or duty of the state, was to produce more innovation. And of course, depending on your political allegiances, you'd have different philosophies of how to do that. In the US, for instance, conservatives tend to believe that the way to produce more innovation is to cut taxes and reduce regulations and get out of the way of entrepreneurs. Whereas Democrats think that, for instance, putting more federal money into university research and science and such will produce more innovation. So there's different philosophies how to do this, but everyone agrees that one duty of the state is to help produce innovation. At about the same time that the term innovation policy was taking off, you also start to see the first books being written about Silicon Valley. And it's important to remember that the first books being written about Silicon Valley in around 1980 or so are, first and foremost, kind of how-to manuals for local city and regional planners. The question is, all right, here's this place, Silicon Valley. It's really hot and it's producing all this growth and profit and such. How do we reproduce Silicon Valley in central Ohio or upstate New York, or eventually in China or India? When I went and gave a talk about this stuff in Australia, the opposition party was talking about creating Kangaroo Valley in Australia. So it became like we're all supposed to copy Silicon Valley. That's the ideal, right? New York City talks about Silicon Alley, but there's this idea that Silicon Valley has some kind of mojo we're all supposed to reproduce or emulate. And then, I can go on, but I think since the 1990s, there's been this kind of self-reinforcing cycle of innovation speak, often this kind of Silicon Valley approved jargon of innovation, disruption, disruptive innovation, killer app, angel investors, thought leaders, agile, lean, entrepreneurship, change agents, design thinking. There's a whole kind of stew of verbiage that has arisen in our culture, especially in some domains like higher ed and the tech world and business and such. And along with this, and I think this goes back to how economists were really originally thinking about innovation. This turn to innovation speak also goes along with what we call the growth delusion, which is a rise of kind of short-term thinking. In the business world, this is affiliated with a focus on short-term growth, quarterly reports, and boosting shareholder value in the short term, and a decline of other kinds of long-term thinking. Now, this belief that we should, that one of our main goals is to produce innovation because of economic growth and changes in quality of life and such, has kind of created space for what we call innovation experts, who are people who come along and, tell you that they have some methods for producing innovation, making you more innovative. Now, you'll see here, we call innovation experts because when you burrow into these folks, it often turns out that their ideas are kind of empty. They're hollow, and they don't pan out. So we highlight a number of innovation experts in the book, but today I thought I would talk about the late Clayton Christensen, a professor at Harvard Business School who died about a year ago, maybe more now. And in his book, his early 1990s book, The Innovator's Dilemma, this is where Clayton Christensen introduced the notion of disruptive innovation, which was a new business model or technology that would kind of blow away existing industries or technologies. And, Clayton Christensen's idea of disruptive innovation really caught on. And he was able to profit from it in a number of ways. For instance, he founded the consultancy, it was called InnoSight, which you could hire to come help your firm become more innovative or avoid being disrupted. I guess, he would come and put like innovation goggles on you or something and give you Innovation Sight. But it turned out when a number of social scientists re-examined Christensen's data, including from his book, The Innovator's Dilemma, it didn't hold up to scrutiny. When social scientists one group of social scientists looked at the theory of disruptive innovation, they found that only 9% of Christensen's supposed examples of disruptive innovation held up to Christensen's own definitions of disruptive innovation. And many other economists have kind of hopped on in that time since then and shown that disruption is not as important into our economy as Christensen claimed, and that it's just not as big of a deal. It's not something that needs to be gain as much attention or foresight from business leaders. And yet business leaders, put hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars into consultants like Christensen trying to think through this notion of disruptive innovation. And as I said in the book, we go through another of other examples. We talk about Richard Florida and his notion of the creative class. We talk about design thinking, which is really hot in certain corporate circles. And we show that there's very little evidence and often counter evidence that these things are really produce more innovation. But we can ask, and this is kind of turning to the costs of innovation speak. What are the costs of innovation speak? Well, one of them, we should be asking ourselves, does innovation speak lead to actual innovation? And we can say for sure that, some bits of innovation speak don't produce what they're promising to do. So here's an example. Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, he has this 10 rules for entrepreneurship. Rule number 1 is look for disruptive change, or basically look to produce disruptive innovation. And there's no evidence that we're producing more disruption or that thinking through disruptive change can help you produce disruption. There's just no evidence about this at all. But on a deeper level, economists like Robert Gordon and others have been arguing that when you look at important measures of productivity and other things, there's a good argument to be made that innovation, actual technological innovation, business innovation, have slowed down or at least plateaued since about 1970. And yet, here's this curve of the engram of use of the word innovation. You can see it's going up and up during this time. So there seems to be a kind of disconnect between talk about innovation and producing the real thing. Talking about it more and more, putting our workers and students through design thinking camps and all this kind of stuff is not producing more of what we actually want. And yet we're wasting all this, both money, paying for these classes, and time, cognitive energy, thinking through this stuff when it's not giving us benefit. And there's other problems too. We can think about how Silicon Valley was earlier held up as a kind of mental model that we're all supposed to reproduce. And yet when we look into Silicon Valley, it's this very unequal place. There's lots of problems with housing prices and homelessness and inequality. And it just thoroughly a kind of problematic place that it's not clear we should want to emulate at all. Now, I want to make one more kind of conceptual point with a little joke, which is that this is crack cocaine. And according to really strict economic definitions of innovation, which is just, introducing a new product to market, this was a really massive innovation in the 1980s, right? Crack cocaine was a really significant innovation. It disrupted other technologies, namely like powdered cocaine. People wanted more and more of it. There's a lot of risky entrepreneurship around it called drug dealing. You can call this guy an innovator, I guess, or an entrepreneur. And my point here with this joke or sarcastic and metaphor here is that we've come to treat innovation as a value or implicit good, a kind of value in itself. Just to say that I'm not completely joking about crime and innovation. Fortune magazine named Enron the most innovative company in America for 6 years in a row before it came out that it was all kind of a fraudulent pyramid scheme of sorts. So my argument is that the costs of innovation speak are high, and that we need to stop treating innovation as an implicit good rather than as a means to some end. And thinking, kind of challenging innovation speak will require us to respond on multiple fronts, including like we can talk about how we need to retool innovation policy. But for the rest of the talk, I'm going to say one thing we need to think through is how innovation speak leads us to neglect maintenance and repair. So that's my second part, neglecting maintenance and repair, or neglecting maintenance and maintainers, I should say. So, first question at one of definitions, what is maintenance? So, maintenance is, we can kind of have several definitions. It's the work that keeps objects in play, that keeps things going. It's a never-ending war against entropy. So we all know, according to the law of thermodynamics, everything is slowly falling apart around us. It's the maintenance, repair, the work we do to fight that process. And maintenance is the work of preserving some desired order, whether it's, keeping an engine running well, or a computer running well, or a house put together nicely, whatever it is. Now, the first point I want to make is that most technology around us is not innovation, or innovative, I should say. And when I'm teaching this kind of stuff, I usually kind of go through this guided meditation with students where I just have them close their eyes and say, like, let's walk through your morning since you woke up. Where did you wake up? Hopefully it was in a bed or somewhere soft and not like in a gutter or wherever. Then what happened? Well, I used some stairs. I went to the bathroom. I went and made myself some cereal. And you kind of just walk through it. And what you see is that most of the technologies, other than like your cell phone or whatever, your laptop, are pretty old, actually, when it comes down to it. Beds are ancient technologies. Toilets are, have not significantly changed in, 100 years. And we can keep going through the list of all the things we've touched. Stairs are tools that go back to Mesopotamia. And so our point is that most of the things that we touch are old. Most human activity features using technologies that are not new, and more human effort and activity goes into maintaining and repairing the things around us than goes into introducing new things, inventing, and innovation. Now, measuring how much human activity goes into maintenance versus innovation is hard, because our national measurements of the economy don't capture maintenance really clearly, but we do have some industry level measures. So here's one breakdown of of activity in the software industry, and studies repeatedly find that if you look at software budgets or software effort, about 60 to 80% of software budgets go into maintenance. So in this pie chart, you can see it's about 67% of effort goes into maintenance, while only 8% goes into design, which is where you'd expect the innovation to happen. Or you can add implementation into the innovation too, design and implementation, but you're still only at 15%. So the lion's share of human effort goes into maintaining things. And you can see this kind of disjunct between the way we talk about the realities of, the way we talk about innovation and technology versus the realities by looking at engineering education. So most engineering education in industrialized nations is focused on design or innovation. A lot of senior design projects require you to say how it's innovative. Yet approximately 70% of working engineers focus on maintenance and operations and oversight of existing systems. So there's a real disjunct here between, on the one hand, the way we talk and think about things, the way we get kids interested in engineering by putting them in robot competitions and stuff, and what we're actually doing on the job, which is keeping things going, basically. Now, now we can kind of talk about how this difference between our rhetoric and reality affects different things. So we can talk about, the growth delusion and infrastructure. Here's the American Society of Civil Engineers infrastructure report card. They repeatedly give, the US like a D or D plus when it comes to maintaining our infrastructure. And, just to give a kind of COVID example, there was this finding that the US had actually hundreds of thousands of ventilators, but the problem was they hadn't been maintained over time. And, to tie this to the growth delusion, Chuck Marone of Strong Towns, who is one of the characters we write about in the book, shows that part of the issue in the US is that the way we've kind of structured our federal infrastructure policy is that the federal dollars go to building new infrastructure, but by taking that money, localities are agreeing to maintain and repair that infrastructure in perpetuity forever until we decide to put it to bed, right? To let it go away or get rid of it. And Marone shows that this means the incentives are set up such that local policymakers and elected officials have really strong incentives to take this basically free money from the federal government and build things, even though there's no tax bases when you actually look at the numbers to maintain it down the road, right? The incentives are set up wrong so that we are building things in the name of growth, but we don't actually have the money to maintain them. And I think we see similar things as we kind of go through organizations and businesses. We often see companies adopt computer systems and other things without thinking through the downstream maintenance costs. And meanwhile, innovation speak has really come to affect organizations, including businesses, I would say, in kind of delusional ways. So one of the companies we highlight in the book is General Electric. In 2016, there was this New York Times article, GE, the 124-year-old software startup, in which General Electric was trying to model itself on Silicon Valley and create all these internal startups and such. 2 years later, here's an article, how General Electric became a general disappointment. General Electric's stock was in the garbage. They had all kinds of problems. Their CEO left, etc. So this kind of adoption of innovation speak and Silicon Valley as a model didn't really work out. You can also look at higher ed. So currently a hot thing is for universities to build innovation campuses, which are, including Virginia Tech's going to build $1 billion innovation campus in Northern Virginia for Amazon. And all these schools are building basically these glass covered buildings and saying all these things are going to produce innovation and growth and stuff. But there's no evidence that they produce innovation or any more innovation or economic growth. There's just no evidence for these claims. So we're just kind of getting these big glass buildings and no payoff. Just to give you an example of what one of these looks like, here's the Pennovation Center at University of Pennsylvania. We also fail to recognize maintainers and the value that they produce, and often we fail to compensate them. So in our culture today under COVID, it's been kind of interesting because there's this whole kind of discourse around essential workers, and there's this kind of recognition that there's these people who keep our society going that we really rely on. Well, that's always true. Even outside of a pandemic, my life is reliant on grocery store workers. And I think if we went through the mix of essential workers, many of these people are not very well compensated. There's also a kind of story to be told about how technological change and social status go hand in hand. So in the 19th century, you really, if you were an up and coming young man, you really wanted to be a mechanic or electrician. These were high status jobs that would really, put you into the middle class. And of course, over time, they go down in status until they become so-called trades. And we can also think of other low status jobs like repair people or janitors or other trades like plumbers and such. So there's a kind of way that maintenance roles become low status over time. There's some argument that this is already happening in the coding world, and over time, computer coding will become more and more blue collar like. And I can say more about that later if that's of interest. Now, one question is, well, how do we learn what jobs have what statuses in the world? How is it that I know, that when I ask my students in class, I say, who wants to be an auto mechanic? This is at Virginia Tech. And they're like, no one raises their hand. So how do we know what's low status and high status? There's lots of answers to this question, but I like one of them kind of posed by this sociologist named John Levy Martin in his famous paper, What Do Animals Do All Day? And what John Levy Martin did is he created a statistical database, a spreadsheet of the characters in Richard Scarry's children book, Busy, Busy Town. And what, if you have never read these books, what Scarry does is he uses these animals to kind of introduce the occupations. And what Levy Martin found is that there are correlations between where animals fall in the status hierarchy and the type of animal they are. Right. So if you live in Busy, Busy Town, the animal you really want to be is Dr. Lion. He's a doctor. He has a nice house. He drives a Land Rover. And then the question is, well, like, who does all the maintenance work? Or, what are the animals most likely to do the maintenance work? And Levy Martin finds that the kind of pig is the stand-in for the average American blue-collar worker in Busy Town. So here's pigs doing a lot of cleanup and maintenance type work. He also finds that pigs are the most likely to cause kind of industrial accidents. You can kind of blame the accidents on the workers. Mr. Paint Pig is a disaster in this respect. He's always kind of causing problems. And here's his cousin, apparently can't, clean a street light without dropping things and breaking things. Here's his wife. She can't vacuum without falling over. Now, the point of John Levy Martin's essay, it's kind of fun and silly, but the point is that, our culture, including things like children's book, and our parents are the ones that teach us where jobs fall in the hierarchy. You know, our parents teach us, you want to be this guy, this kind of person. You want to go to college and become this kind of worker. You don't want to become this, blah, blah, blah. And there's far-reaching consequences for lots of things, including how much money we make and inequalities, including around gender and race and such. So we're doing some work with the United Way ALICE program, which stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained Employed. And what we've done with ALICE is we've broken down a bunch of different occupations from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we've put them kind of in a thought experiment into different categories of maintenance and innovation. So here you can see that there's inventors and adapters. That's at the top. Those are the kind of innovation positions. And the two bottom ones are nurturers and infrastructures, kind of maintainers positions. And the issue here, first of all, there's many more kind of maintenance type people than there are innovators. Okay, that's clear. But the bigger issue is that the workers here marked in blue are basically the working poor. They're the people in the United States who don't have enough to make it paycheck by paycheck. And so the point is that these kind of status hierarchies around occupations have really big implications for our lives and who has enough to make it in the world. We can also, talk about growth delusion in ourselves and our homes. We can, sometimes it often is the case that people, mostly what they want to talk to me and my buddy Andy about is like their bodies and their everyday lives. We can think about like short-term thinking and the way we eat and the way we put off exercising and eating healthy and all these things. And we can look at trends around obesity and other kind of health outcomes in the States. We can also look at the average size of the U.S. home and how, as over time, we've grown our house bigger and bigger. And, we can also talk about how we've bought more and more goods because goods have become more and more cheap and also more and more disposable. Like 50%, something like 50% of garages in the United States have so much stuff in them that you can't park a car in them. So we've kind of been taking on all this stuff. We've been growing the household through debt and all kinds of things. And meanwhile, it's also become harder to maintain and repair the goods that we are buying. So there's been a lot of, you can look into their so-called right to repair movement. There's been a lot of pressure on firms like Apple, John Deere, and many other companies would have been kind of locking down our ability to repair our phones and tractors and such. Meanwhile, Apple doesn't support our iPhones forever. So over time, they become, they start breaking down. Eventually, they're not supported at all, and we're kind of forced to get rid of them and get other new things. And of course, this has huge environmental repercussions because more energy goes into making a phone than charging a phone for like 10 years. So when it comes to the climate change and just, in unsustainable production practices, we really need to repair and keep our things for as long as possible. And yet companies are making this very difficult, sometimes impossible to do. So what's the answer then? And our answer, part of what we're saying, again, I think criticizing innovation speak and coming up with other ways of thinking about our culture is going to take all kinds of responses. But when it comes to how innovation speak affects maintenance and repair in this work of just keeping things going in our society, which is what most of us are doing, we argue that one thing we need to do is adopt what we call the maintenance mindset. And there's kind of 3 steps to the maintenance mindset in our picture. So the first is that maintenance sustains success. When we need to make an argument for why we need to maintain things better, including in businesses and things like universities, part of the point is that maintenance leads to better maintenance leads to better profits. It leads to better environmental outcomes. There's a whole suite of very obvious benefits that coming from doing good maintenance, and yet it's hard to argue for sometimes. Maintenance depends on culture and management. So you really need leaders who see the value of maintenance and can implement new ways of doing things. This is kind of irony of maintenance, is that to really do a good job repairing and maintaining stuff, doing a good job of keeping an organization going, you also need to create maintain a healthy and positive culture that sees the benefit of this. So sees ways of passing on knowledge and ways of thinking about technology. And finally, maintenance requires constant care. And that means it also benefits from, innovation in maintenance. There's ways we can improve our maintenance practices, including by, adopting new technologies like digital maintenance systems. And to give one example, we highlight a number of companies that we see as like really putting forward a positive vision of the maintenance mindset. Two of the companies that I'll talk about just very briefly are Fix and Upkeep, which are two firms that create software for maintenance management. And they're both very deeply influenced by the notion of the triple bottom line, which is people, planet, and profit. And they find that, when it comes to their own workers, they really see that, people see the benefit of maintenance, including for the environment, because better maintained things use less energy, produce less greenhouse gas emissions. And that's meaningful to their folks. Now, when it comes to applying the maintenance mindset to infrastructure, I think our argument is that we need to give up the growth delusion that Chuck Marohn talks about. And, it's too often that when we talk about infrastructure policy in the United States, we're really talking about building new stuff. Okay. This is especially true of Trump, but it's not like we shouldn't beat up on him alone, right? Trump likes to build things and put his name on them, but this is what parties and politicians like to do, because you can do a ribbon cutting in front of a new thing. And our argument, and we're following and going along with lots of other folks here, is that we need to adopt a fix it first mentality. We in this COVID recession, it would be a wonderful thing to put a bunch of money into maintaining infrastructure, and we should prioritize maintenance and repair of existing infrastructure over building new structures, which is not to say there's not an argument for sometimes building new structures. I can think of lots of them we could use, but we should really prioritize fixing it first. Now, with workers, what our argument is that we need to do a better job recognizing and compensating maintainers. Now, recognition is absolutely essential. We can go to, libraries and places all over our culture, any organization, and find people maintaining that organization and its workflows who are often not getting recognition for the work they're doing. You can think of open source maintainers who, aren't getting that recognition, and it ends up affecting, whether they stay on the job or not, or find it rewarding. But even, recognition is not enough. We also need to compensate maintainers. And as I kind of walk you through the essential workers things, there's in the Alice United Way data, there's lots of maintainers in our culture that are not being compensated enough. And we need to do a better job of paying them. How do we apply the maintenance mindset to our homes? I can give lots of examples. In my own family, we've instituted a kind of weekly family meeting where we do things like plan our finances and our chores and all this kind of stuff. And, as part of that, we've actually instituted a maintenance budget, both for the house and the automobile. So that we'll have enough money when problems come down the road. Now, of course, that takes, being in a place of relative affluence and privilege. And I wouldn't want to, say that I'm not privileged in that way. But still, there are things we can adopt in our private lives to make maintenance at home better. And part of it's about adopting a kind of mindset of care, caring for others, caring for ourselves, caring for our coworkers. I think we draw somewhat on, feminist philosophy, ethics of care stuff, and say that really this is like what we're trying to do is engender a more caring society. And two other kind of ways that we can better improve maintenance at home in the personal lives, we talk about places like repair cafes and tool libraries. There are kind of movements popping up around the world to do a better job repairing stuff instead of just throwing it away. And, I think that this movement is important in lots of ways, including just because it changes our mindset about stuff and encourages not to see our things as so disposable. And finally, I want to say that, through this work and learning about the things that Apple and John Deere and all these companies do to lock down repair, I've become a pretty strong advocate of the right to repair movement. Including I've actually stopped buying. I used to be a real Apple fan. I've now stopped buying Apple products because of their repair policies, which I think are just environmentally unsustainable and also unjust, because I think we should all have the right to repair the stuff that we buy. And you can go to repair.org or just look up right to repair and learn a lot about that movement. Now, there's several ways that you can or maybe at least a few ways that you can end a book like The Innovation Delusion. You can have a kind of list of policies that you want to put in place, but as one example, but Andy and I decided we didn't want to do that. What we really want to do is invite people to a conversation about how we can, as a culture, we can do a better job at these things. And I think that this, unlike the consultants like Christensen and company, we're not saying that we have the answers to all your problems. We want to learn from you and learn about the problems in whatever space you're working in. And so it really is a conversation. I would invite you to check out themaintainers.org. You can sign up for our email listserv. It's a wonderful community of people who share ideas about repair and maintenance. You can also drop me an email. There's lots of emails available for me online. You can just look me up. One of them is lee@themaintainers.org. I'm on Twitter at STS News. And I want to thank Julia and Fred and company again for having me today. And I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Lee. That was very interesting. A lot of interesting perspectives there. So we do have some good questions that came in. So I'll get right into those so we have time to answer them. First one is, it was interesting that the subtitle for the maintainers' response to the innovators listed introverts along with other maintainers. Curious about prescription for inclusion of introvert influence policy in worlds steered by extroverts. Perhaps related to this is how we should balance good idea fairies with need to predict unintended consequences and value of saying no or wait.
Can you say that last part again? I got the first part about the
steered by extroverts. Yes. Yeah. Perhaps related to this is how we should balance good idea fairies with the need to predict unintended consequences and value of saying no or wait.
Yeah. Well, those are two really great points, I think. So it's funny because when we started working on this project, people started talking to us about Susan Cain's book, Quiet, about introverts. And I think there's two things going on here. The first thing is that what Susan Cain does with introverts in that book, which is show that our culture is very reliant on introverts, and yet we kind of devalue them and don't give them enough recognition, is a lot like our argument with the maintainers. But the other thing, and I don't want to stereotype people, but we find that a lot of maintainers actually are introverts, and they're drawn to the values of these kind of behind the scenes upkeep and jobs. Because of, they're not kind of front stage, flashy things to do. And so I think that, there's a lot to be learned from Cain about how we can, listen to people and recognize those people we really rely on. That, there's different ways of, organizing meetings, for instance, so that the extroverts don't kind of lord over the entire thing and they're the only people who you hear from, including things like playing with Post-it notes and doing different group activities. And I think that touches on the second thing about, good idea fairies and the need to think about unintended consequences and just say no, is that there has to be more realistic conversations about what we can do as organizations, including what technologies we should be adopting and what we shouldn't, because their maintenance costs are too high. And to have those realistic conversations, again, to go back to introverts, we really need to be listening to everyone in the organization and not just like the people who are flashy and have ideas about AI or, 3D printers, whatever the hot thing, or VR or whatever it is.
Okay. The next question. I recently listened to a talk out of Intel and the ASEE with a mention of this problem that new engineering grads are not proportionately prepared to work with and maintain in-place systems. Do you think the engineering education itself has changed in recent decades to focus on creation more than repair and maintenance? For example, did we used to teach engineers more about maintenance?
That's a good question. So, I think what you find is like there's always these kind of ways of talking about the gap between preparation and jobs and what jobs need and what we give students. And we should be skeptical of those for various reasons, including because lots of them are focused on innovation. It's like what we need on the job is more design thinking and stuff. And so I was somewhat skeptical about those things. And yet I think for this gap, about the maintenance and repair of things versus design, I think there's good reasons to think there's been change over time, especially when we look at earlier decades, before 1980 or 1990, where part of engineering and education involved working with things, right? You worked in machine shops and, you put hands-on a lot. And I think that hands-on knowledge teaches you about maintenance and repair in ways that just learning about design and kind of abstract models doesn't teach you. And so I actually have an essay. You can write me a note if you'd like, or I can point you to it, on how we need to reform engineering education to make it a bit more focused on maintenance repair by giving people, for instance, more varied forms of senior design or senior projects, capstone projects, to include things like how you keep a water system running or whatever, and not just focus on design, because most of our grads won't be doing that work.
Next question. This is a great perspective on sustainability. Related to creative class, is there a better way to recognize and incentivize the creativity and problem solving necessary to good maintenance?
Wow, that is a tough one. Part of what we're trying to do in the book is, first of all, make an argument for cultural change and value change and leadership change. There are ways that we could use policymaking to encourage infrastructure maintenance, for instance, by making, for example, municipalities show how much infrastructure debt and make sure they're dealing with that infrastructure debt before they take on new infrastructural debt. And we can also, use policies to encourage companies like gadget makers to make products that are maintainable over the long haul, right? Or, for instance, Sweden put into effect a tax policy that gives you a tax break if you repair things as opposed to throw them out. So I think there's a bunch of policy options out there. But I would say one thing I want to make clear, because I hope I made clear that I'm not like anti-innovation, I'm more anti-innovation speak, is that, if you think about something like climate change, it's going to require a bunch of good maintenance and good innovation. We got to get a bunch of new technologies like renewables out there and stuff like that. Meanwhile, we need to maintain things better so they're not using so much energy. And we can just do things like rehab our houses and make them more winter friendly and more energy friendly, right? So there's a mix when it comes to complex problems like that of both innovation and maintenance that should go hand in hand rather than be enemies or something.
You mentioned earlier about coding becoming blue collar. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah. I think for a long time, I work at universities and I'm a big defender of education and people going to college. But I think for a long time, there was an assumption that to get good computer jobs, you needed to get a CS degree or go to university. And I think a lot of companies are starting to question whether whether they really need workers with that kind of computer training. And so there's pushes for creating kind of, more vocational training programs at the community college level. Or I think the even bigger threat to university training programs of the long haul is that earlier this year, I think it was in January, I can look it up for you, Google introduced the idea of giving its own IT certificate that, I don't know, takes like 6 weeks or, a couple months most. And then they would hire people who got those certificates. And I think that's a real threat to this idea that you need like a college degree, or that, it's going to be that computer jobs are always going to be a great paying, job forever. There's lots of, kind of ways that it could become more vocational or blue collar over time.
Okay. Have you seen any data about the maintenance in the workplace spaces and worker morale?
I think the short answer is no. I think there's not good studies on that yet. I'm actually with other people trying to get research on this topic going, including the, not just workers, but just like the connection between good maintenance and repair practices and like positive psychology and morale in everyday life. But we have lots of anecdotes about, good maintenance practices and morale. I can give one quick example, which is that I talked to an engineer at Oracle, which is a huge software company and, very famous one. And he really does a lot of maintenance of code. And yet in Oracle, that is a highly valued and even high status job because the company's smart and realizes that's important. So I think that there are lots of anecdotes about the relationship between good maintenance and good morale. But like we need better studies.
Okay. How do we convince those huge companies like Apple to go back to the maintenance mindset when it threatens their bottom line?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying threatens their bottom line. It really does threaten their bottom line. I wrote an essay, it's up on Medium, about why I decided to give up Apple products. And one of the things I talk about is, you may remember that there was this moment where Apple started doing battery replacements for free because of this problem they had. They were ratcheting down people's phone speeds. And during that, when they had that free battery replacement program, people took advantage of it. And they got their phones repaired, and instead of buying new iPhones, and the stock price of Apple plummeted during that period because they sold fewer phones. And I think, I'm kind of, my first book is called Moving Violations, on the history of automobile regulation. I really think this in the end is going to have to be a regulatory push by all of us as voters and by the government to get companies to kind of deal with this stuff. I don't think it's going to kind of be out of the goodness of their hearts, because as you said, they have every incentive to cheap kind of like turning out phones rather than creating, repairable phones that will be repaired for a long time.
Okay. Is creating a new certificate program or new degree program in higher ed really considered innovative?
I guess it depends on who you talk to. I mean, well, you can look at how universities copy each other all over the place. And one of the strategies to make money over the last 15 or 20 years has been the creation of master's degree programs of various sorts, because for-pay master's degrees are, highly profitable. So, I mean, it's certainly been a kind of innovation, whether it's like a deep innovation that matters in the end to our economy and such. I'm very skeptical of that, but it's been a form of emulative, innovative activity in higher ed.
And then here's another question. It's kind of long, but I'll read through it and see if you can figure out what the question is here. I'm in the communication field and the humanities. I found a lot of use in design thinking and innovation talk, just in terms of attracting students and public audiences back to profound thought, as opposed to the culture's bigger message, which seems get a job. Thus, just get the credentials and don't ask questions. At least the possibility that something positive and new can be developed in language has worked. Does that seem right? And any advice to avoid negative stereotypes developed against maintenance culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think that innovation speak can be useful in some contexts. I always tell friends that friends will come to me and say like, well, I use innovation speak all the time in my startup. And I'm like, well, you kind of have to, right? Like if you're not talking in that way, people aren't going to listen to you because that's what you're supposed to be doing. I just think, especially when we're talking to students, we have to be wary of what we're selling them. Most of them are not going to go into these kind of innovative, designy roles when they graduate. So I agree that, I teach a class on innovation and I see how appealing it is to students who want to be the new Elon Musk or whatever. But like, that's just like, I'm selling them a bill of goods if like, that's like the only focus of the program. So I think we actually have to be quite morally careful when it comes to how we talk about these issues.
Okay, and looks like we have one last question. Do you think a good psychological assessment would be an ethical beginning to score one's morale for specific infrastructure maintenance?
I'm not quite sure what this question's asking, I think. But I will say, I think that there's really deep psychological issues at play here. And I'll just briefly mention two of them. I mean, the first one's what we talked about of how we going through our culture, we end up with these kind of cognitive maps of value hierarchies of innovators and maintainers and this kind of stuff. That's a psychological question. And in fact, we're starting a psychological research project looking into that issue. The other thing I think is this whole issue of short-term thinking and, putting, like whether we're willing to put off short-term gain for down the road benefit, for instance. And there's really deep questions about how much of that is strictly biological, how much are humans like wired to be that way versus culture. So for instance, apparently South Koreans are more willing to put off short-term benefit for long-term gain than Americans are. So I think there's a bunch of interesting psychological questions around these issues of innovation and maintenance and, creating healthy infrastructure, for instance. But I also think we have, a lot of this research hasn't been done yet, and we need to do more of it.
Okay, great. Well, this was definitely an interesting topic. Thank you for your time and spending with us today.
Thanks, Julia. It's been wonderful. Thanks for having me.
And just a reminder to all of our viewers and that the recording will be available tomorrow, and the link to Lee's book will be found right at right underneath the video there. So thanks everyone. Have a great day.